The show Against 50 is a format where a celebrity sits before 50 people who have grievances, questions, or simply a desire to vent their anger. It wasn't a talk show in the classic sense. It was an arena where every blow had to be real and every response measured. De Niro knew he wasn't facing fans but haters, people who saw him not as a legend but as a symbol of everything that irritated them: wealth, influence, political outspokenness. Yet he agreed to do it. Why? He wasn't entirely sure himself, perhaps to prove he could still weather a storm. Maybe to show that behind all those roles was a man unafraid to face his critics head-on. Or perhaps because he was tired of hiding behind silence. This story is worth reading to the end. Trust me, something's coming that will make you rethink everything. He adjusted the collar of his navy blazer, took a deep breath, and nodded to the assistant who nervously knocked on the door. "Mr. De Niro, 5 minutes," she said, her voice trembling as if she feared what awaited him on stage. He gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. In the corridor, voices hummed, equipment clattered, and muffled laughter echoed. He overheard a producer whispering, "This is going to be a triumph or a disaster." De Niro paid it no mind. He'd been through hell, both in his career and his life. But tonight, something in the air made his heart beat faster. A hint of something big lingered in the studio, though he didn't yet know what it was. When he stepped onto the stage, the lights blinded him for a moment. 50 pairs of eyes stared at him from semicircular tiers. The faces varied, young and old, angry and skeptical, some with faint smirks, as if they'd come to watch a legend fall. The host, a man with a perfectly bleached smile named Kyle Reed, greeted him with thunderous applause that quickly faded. "Robert De Niro, welcome to Against 50. Tonight, you're here to answer the toughest questions from people who, let's just say, don't always agree with you," Kyle said, a slight irony in his tone. De Niro sat in the chair at the stage's center, crossed his legs, and nodded. "I'm ready," he said in his raspy voice, and the room fell silent. The quiet was heavy, like the calm before a storm. The first question came from an elderly woman in the front row. She stood, clutching a notebook as if she'd prepared for this moment for weeks. "Mr. De Niro, you talk a lot about politics, about caring for people. But when was the last time you lived on $1,200 a month, like most retirees in this country?" Her voice was calm but laced with bitterness. The crowd murmured, some clapping. De Niro looked at her, unflinching. "I haven't lived on $1,200 in a long time, that's true," he began, his voice free of excuses or arrogance. "But I grew up in a family where my parents barely made ends meet. I remember my mother counting every penny to buy me new shoes for school. I don't claim to know what it's like to live like that now. But I use my voice to speak for those who struggle. If that looks like hypocrisy, I'm ready to hear what you think." The woman sat down without another word, her face impassive. The crowd buzzed, but De Niro felt he'd deflected the first blow. The next question was sharper. A young man in a denim jacket stood and spoke quickly as if afraid of being cut off. "You bash Trump, but you're a millionaire with your own restaurant. Which of you is really the man of the people? You don't ride the subway or stand in supermarket lines. Why should we listen to you?" His words were a challenge, and the crowd erupted in applause. De Niro leaned forward, his fingers gripping the armrests. "I'm not a man of the people, in the way you mean," he said, his voice hardening. "I earned my money, and I don't apologize for it. But I don't sit idle. I support charities. I help veterans. I speak out about what I see as injustice. What do you do besides criticize me here? Name one thing you've done for the people." The guy flushed, sat down, and muttered something under his breath. The crowd split. Some jeered, others clapped. De Niro felt adrenaline surge through his veins. It was like a boxing ring, and he was still on his feet. But the real storm began when a man in his late 30s stood up. His name was Nate, and he looked like someone who wore his anger like armor. He had a stern face, short cropped hair, and a tattoo peeking out from under his shirt sleeve. He took the microphone and spoke with unconcealed disdain. "You've played tough guys for years, but in real life, you yell at your assistant for turning on Netflix? That's your manhood, huh? A little power, and you're a king?" The crowd gasped. Some laughed. De Niro felt his cheeks burn. The story, twisted and inflated by tabloids, stemmed from a conflict with a former assistant who'd sued over unacceptable behavior. The case was long settled, but the stain lingered. "You believe everything you read in the papers?" De Niro replied, calm but with a steely edge. "I'm not perfect. I can be sharp, I can lose my temper, but I don't belittle people for kicks. That assistant got a settlement and we parted ways peacefully. When's the last time you owned up to a mistake, Nate?" The man didn't back down. He smirked, but it was cold. "You're all about the little guy, right? Yet you dine at restaurants costing thousands and fly private jets. Isn't that funny? The simple Bronx kid is gone, just a rich old man playing hero." The crowd exploded, and Kyle Reed barely hid his grin, sensing the show's ratings skyrocketing. De Niro felt anger rising in his throat but forced himself to breathe evenly. "Yeah, I eat at expensive restaurants," he said, his voice quieter but piercing. "And I fly jets. But I also pay taxes that fund schools and hospitals. I donate millions to charities you've probably never noticed. What have you done, Nate? Name one thing." Nate gripped the microphone so hard his knuckles whitened. "I work construction, raise 2 kids, and don't pretend I'm some messiah," he snapped. The crowd buzzed again, and De Niro realized this man wasn't just a hater. There was pain in his words, and that pain resonated with others in the room. "You're a good father, I can see that," De Niro said unexpectedly, his tone softening. "I respect that. But don't blame me for living my life. I'm not pretending to be a messiah. I'm just a man trying to make a difference." For a moment, Nate seemed speechless, but he quickly recovered and threw another sharper question. "You talk about fighting for justice? Then explain why your company spent hundreds of thousands on personal drivers and fancy lunches while your employee was suing you for how you treated her." The argument was gaining momentum, and the air in the studio grew thick with tension. De Niro felt every gaze fixed on him, every word carrying more weight than ever. He knew he couldn't afford to snap, but Nate was hitting his sore spots. This wasn't just an attack. It was an attempt to dismantle his reputation, his legacy. Deep inside, De Niro sensed this fight was only beginning. Something big was brewing, and he didn't yet know where it would lead. But one thing he knew for sure. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Nate's latest question, about De Niro's company spending lavishly on luxury while an employee fought for justice in court, hung in the air, the audience holding its breath for a response. De Niro felt anger and shame wrestling in his chest, but he knew he couldn't let himself explode. He leaned forward, his voice low and measured, as if about to tell a story no one had heard before. "My company isn't just me," he began. "It's dozens of people working to keep things moving. Yes, we spent money on drivers, on lunches, but you know, Nate, I don't sit with a calculator checking every receipt. I trust the people who run it. And when I learned about the lawsuit, I insisted it be settled fairly. She got a settlement, and we moved on. But you seem to think I'm sitting in an office laughing at the little people? That's not true," the crowd murmured. But this time, the noise carried more doubt than support. Nate smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Fair, you say? What about yelling at her over some trivial thing? That's fair too?" De Niro gripped the armrests of his chair. "I'm no saint," he said, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. "I can be harsh when I'm tired or under pressure. But I don't humiliate people for fun. Have you ever lost your temper, Nate? Or are you always perfect?" The crowd burst into laughter, but Nate didn't back down. He took a step forward, as if throwing down a gauntlet. "The difference is, I'm not some rich old man who thinks he can do whatever he wants." The argument hit its peak, and Kyle Reed, the host, finally stepped in, trying to diffuse the atmosphere. All right, let's cool it down a bit," he said, but his smile looked forced. De Niro felt his heart pounding, yet he didn't break eye contact with Nate. Nate stood firm, microphone in hand, his eyes blazing with anger that seemed to come from a deeper place than mere hatred for a celebrity. De Niro suddenly realized this wasn't just about him. It was something personal for Nate. And then he said something that shifted the show's course. "You know, Nate, you keep talking about my money, my jets, my restaurants, but I give more than you can imagine. I support veterans who come back from war with no roof over their heads. I've funded hospitals when no one else paid attention. And you? You just open your mouth and criticize people who've achieved something. What have you done besides stand here and accuse me? The crowd froze. Nate was speechless for a moment, his face flushing, but he quickly regained control. I'm not an actor. I don't star in movies or bask in fame. I work to put food on the table for my kids, and I don't use veterans as a shield to look better. Those words hit De Niro harder than he expected. He felt a tightness in his chest, not because Nate was right, but because there was truth in his voice, the truth of a man who fights every day without cameras or applause. De Niro opened his mouth to respond but stopped short. He looked at Nate, then at the crowd, and something inside him shifted. Kyle, he said, turning to the host, his voice oddly calm. I want this man to leave the show. The crowd gasped. Kyle Reed looked stunned, his perfect smile vanishing. You serious, Robert? He asked, clearly unsure how to react. Yes, De Niro replied, his eyes fixed on Nate. I came here to talk, not to be doused in mud for ratings. If he wants to fight, let him do it somewhere else. Nate laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Oh, sure, the great De Niro can't take the heat. Run along, old man. Security approached Nate, and he tossed the microphone to the floor, walking out to a mix of boos and cheers from the crowd. That moment was a turning point, but not in the way De Niro had hoped. The crowd split. Some shouted that he was right, others fumed that he couldn't handle criticism. Kyle Reed quickly regained control, calling on the next participant, but the studio's atmosphere had changed. De Niro answered other questions, about politics, his career, his views, but his mind kept drifting back to Nate. Why was he so angry? Why did his words hurt so much? The show went on, but De Niro felt like he was no longer in a ring but in a maze, each turn leading to new doubts. He answered clearly, with dignity, but a new note crept into his voice. Not anger, but something like weariness. Don't you think an actor shouldn't be a political preacher? One woman asked, and he replied, maybe not. But I can't stay silent when I see injustice. If that bothers you, sorry. I won't stop. The crowd applauded, but De Niro felt those claps no longer mattered as much. When the show ended, he returned to the green room, exhausted as if he'd run a marathon. His agent, Marcia, waited with a bottle of water and a worried look. You tore them apart, Bobby, she said, but her voice was uncertain. But that moment with Nate, it's gonna be everywhere. De Niro nodded, avoiding her gaze. He sat before the mirror, shedding his blazer, and suddenly felt silence crash over him. The show was over, but it wasn't the end. Social media was already ablaze with debates. Some called him a hero who stood his ground, others an arrogant rich man who couldn't face the truth. Clips of Nate's challenge went viral, with posts claiming De Niro looked weak for ejecting a participant. But some noticed something in his eyes, a moment of doubt. Perhaps the first time in years he felt not like a legend, but just a man. Later, as De Niro sat in a car driving through nighttime New York, he pulled out his phone and searched for Nate's name. He didn't know why, but he needed a hint of what drove this man. And he found it. A local newspaper article mentioned Nate, a veteran who returned from Iraq with PTSD, lost his job in layoffs, and now struggled to support his family. There was a photo. Nate with two girls hugging him at a playground. De Niro's throat went dry. He recalled Nate's words about his kids, his fight. Suddenly, it all clicked. Nate didn't just hate him. He hated a world that shone blindly on people like De Niro while leaving men like him in the shadows. The next day, De Niro did something unexpected. Through his charitable foundation, he contacted a veterans organization and asked them to find Nate. He wanted no publicity, no cameras, no headlines. He offered to pay for Nate's children's education and provide access to therapy. He expected no apologies or thanks. He just wanted to do what felt right. Nate initially refused but accepted a month later, sending a brief note. I haven't changed my mind about you, but thanks for my girls. De Niro kept the note in a drawer alongside awards and fan letters. He told no one, not even Marcia. Social media eventually moved on to other scandals, but that night left a mark. For some, De Niro remained a rich old man. For others, a man who dared to step into the arena and stay there, despite it all. But for him, that night changed something deeper. He realized fame wasn't emptiness but weight, and the real fight happens not on stage but in the lives of those in the shadows. This story had no Hollywood happy ending, but it was true, and maybe that's why it stayed with him forever.